At 7 minutes past 11, on Saturday morning, the first car turned onto my gravel driveway. 8 minutes later, there were 17 cars, a rented shuttle, 40 guests dressed for church, and my mother standing outside the gate with a white anniversary cake balanced in her hands. Sheriff Calvin Ross stood beside me on the porch. My mother looked past him toward the upstairs window, where she believed my 15-year-old daughter was waiting to be locked away, while strangers filled our home. Then she turned toward the camera near the gate and smiled. "Grace," she called loudly enough for everyone to hear, "tell the sheriff this is a family celebration. Tell him you invited us." I did not move. 5 days earlier, I had explained that Willa had just returned home after a bone marrow transplant. Her doctors had warned me that an ordinary respiratory infection could send her back to the hospital. There could be no crowds, no surprise visitors, and no exceptions made for anniversaries. My mother had answered with 4 words. "Lock her upstairs then." I had replied, "All right." She thought I had surrendered. What those words really meant was that I had stopped trying to make her understand. Now 40 people were staring at me. Some looked angry, some looked confused, and several were holding sealed envelopes my parents had asked them to sign after the cake was cut. My father stepped forward and told the sheriff that grief had made me unstable. My mother said I had been keeping their sick granddaughter away from everyone who loved her. The camera beside the gate kept recording, because that was the part they had planned. They wanted me frightened. They wanted me shouting. Most of all, they wanted 40 witnesses to remember the version of me they had already written down on paper. Sheriff Ross opened the folder in his hand and looked at my parents. "Ma'am, before anyone enters this property, we need to discuss what happened here last night." My mother's smile disappeared. She believed I had called 911 because I was afraid of a party. She had no idea I had called because she and my father had tried to force their way into the home where my immunocompromised daughter was recovering, after receiving written notice to stay away. She also had no idea that one of her own guests was carrying a statement describing my public breakdown before I had even stepped outside. Stay with me to discover how my parents turned their anniversary into a trap, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about family betrayal, justice, and the courage to protect the people we love. 5 days earlier, I drove Willa home from the transplant center beneath a pale Ohio sky. She sat in the passenger seat, wearing a soft gray mask, a knitted cap pulled over the fine new growth on her head. At 15, she was old enough to understand every warning her doctors had given us, but young enough that I still wanted to protect her from the fear beneath those warnings. For weeks, I had imagined bringing her back to the farmhouse. I pictured the maple trees along the driveway, the wraparound porch, and the narrow trail leading past the barn. I wanted home to feel like the end of something terrible. The doctors had been careful not to let us believe that. Willa had survived the transplant, but her immune system was still rebuilding itself. A fever could mean an immediate return to the hospital. Anyone with a cough, a sore throat, or even the beginning of a cold had to stay away. Visitors needed to be approved in advance, and food had to be handled with more care than either of us had ever considered before. As I turned onto our driveway, Willa lowered the window less than an inch and breathed in. "I have spent enough of my life under fluorescent lights," she said. "I need to see a real tree before somebody takes more blood." I glanced at her and smiled. "No one is taking blood today. That sounds like something people say right before taking blood." Her voice was quiet, but the humor was still there. That mattered to me more than I could explain. Daniel and I had bought the farmhouse 12 years earlier. We had saved for the down payment, signed the mortgage, and repaired nearly every room ourselves. My parents had never contributed money to it, but my mother had begun calling it the family farm as soon as we finished restoring the porch. I had corrected her at first. Eventually, I stopped. Daniel used to tell me that my mother treated any boundary left undefended as an invitation. He said it gently, never trying to make me choose between him and my family. He had been gone for 3 years, but I heard his voice clearly as I parked beside the house. Willa looked toward the maple tree, where Daniel had once hung a tire swing for her. She had been 3 years old when we married, and one of my favorite photographs showed her walking between us after the ceremony, holding one of our hands in each of hers. She stared at the tree for several seconds. "Dad would have hated all these rules," she said. "He would have hated that you needed them," I replied. "He would have followed everyone." Inside, the farmhouse no longer looked like the home we had left months earlier. Before bringing Willa back, I had removed unnecessary rugs, washed every blanket, and moved the plants out of the living room, so damp soil would not become another concern. A bottle of hand sanitizer sat beside the front door. On the kitchen wall, I had taped a medication chart with boxes for morning, afternoon, and evening. A digital thermometer rested beside a list of emergency numbers, including the transplant center's 24-hour line. Willa studied the arrangement. "You turned the living room into a nurse's station." "I prefer command center." "Can a command center have hot chocolate?" "When your care team clears it." She groaned, but there was no real complaint in it. She lowered herself onto the couch and looked through the windows at the fields. For the first time in months, there were no machines humming around her, and no footsteps passing her door every few minutes. The silence felt fragile. I wanted to place both hands around it and keep anyone from breaking it. My mother had already tested that silence, while Willa was still in the hospital. 2 weeks before discharge, Marjorie had arrived at the transplant floor with 2 women from her church. She had not called me first. She simply appeared at the security desk and told the nurse that Willa needed prayer and familiar faces. The women were kind, as far as I knew, but one of them had recently mentioned recovering from a lingering cough. I asked the staff not to let them upstairs. My mother called me from the lobby. "You are humiliating me in front of people who came here because they care." "This is a protected unit, Mom. Willa cannot have surprise visitors." "They drove 40 minutes. That does not change her immune system." She told our relatives that I had used Willa's illness to cut the family off. By the following afternoon, 3 people had sent me careful messages, asking whether I was overwhelmed, as though exhaustion had made me unreasonable. I had still tried to preserve the relationship. Every few days, I sent my parents a photograph of Willa. I suggested video calls when she had enough energy. I promised that once Dr. Patel approved visitors, we could arrange a short meeting with masks and no physical contact. My mother never answered those specific offers. She responded with messages about how painful it was to be treated like a stranger. That first afternoon home, Willa slept for almost 3 hours. I checked her temperature twice without waking her, then sat at the kitchen table answering messages from work. I had returned to remote bookkeeping in small blocks, enough to keep our bills organized without leaving her alone. By evening, she managed half a bowl of soup. We watched an old game show together, and for nearly 40 minutes, our lives felt ordinary. At 9:17, my phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was a group message from my mother. My father, my Aunt Eleanor, and several relatives were included. "Change of plans for our 40th anniversary. The original venue is no longer available. Grace, clear the farmhouse by Friday. We will be hosting 40 guests there on Saturday." I read it twice, because my mind rejected the words the first time. Willa was curled beneath a blanket beside me. She did not notice my expression because she was watching a contestant struggle to answer a question about state capitals. I carried my phone into the kitchen before replying. "There must be a misunderstanding. No gathering can take place here while Willa is recovering. Her doctors have prohibited crowds and unapproved visitors." My mother did not answer immediately. For a moment, I convinced myself she had forgotten the discharge date. Perhaps the venue had canceled suddenly, and she had sent the message before thinking. It was easier to believe in carelessness than intention. Then my father replied, "We only need the downstairs rooms in the yard. You and Willa will not have to participate. The arrangements have already been made." There was no question in his message, no apology, and no request for permission. He wrote like a man informing a hotel manager when his guests would arrive. I looked through the doorway at my daughter asleep beneath the blanket, finally safe in the home Daniel and I had built for her. That was when I understood my parents were not asking to borrow my farmhouse. They were telling me when they intended to take it over. My father's message remained on the screen while I stood in the kitchen, listening to the television murmur from the next room. They only needed the downstairs rooms and the yard. According to him, Willa and I would not have to participate, as though remaining hidden inside our own home were a reasonable compromise. I did not want another argument conducted through a family group message. Text allowed my mother to ignore every point she disliked, then show relatives only the replies that made her appear wounded. I stepped into the laundry room, closed the door, and called her directly. She answered on the third ring. "I knew you would calm down. Once you thought about it," she said. "I am not calling because I changed my mind. I am calling to make sure there is no misunderstanding." My mother released a slow breath, the kind she had used throughout my childhood whenever she wanted me to know I was making a simple matter difficult. I explained that Willa could not remain upstairs while 40 people gathered below her. Guests would enter through the same doors, breathe the same indoor air, use the same bathrooms, touch the same railings, and move through the same hallways. Keeping my daughter in one bedroom would not turn the rest of the house into a safe environment. "We can put a sign on the stairs," my mother said. "No one will go near her." "That is not enough. You are talking as though everyone we know is carrying a disease." "I am talking the way her transplant team taught me to talk. Someone can be contagious before they know they are sick." My father's voice came through the background. A few seconds later, my mother placed the call on speaker. Walter rarely began the family arguments. He preferred to let my mother make the demands, then enter once I resisted so he could present himself as the reasonable one. "You have made your point, Grace," he said. "Now you need to listen to ours. There is nothing to negotiate about Willa's medical safety. That is exactly the problem. Every rule becomes final because you attach the word medical to it." I gripped the edge of the washing machine and reminded myself that anger would not make them listen. I repeated what Dr. Patel had said before discharge. Willa's immune system was still rebuilding. A routine respiratory infection could become an emergency. Even a brief gathering created risks her doctors had specifically warned us to avoid. My mother interrupted before I finished. "Then lock her upstairs." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. She continued in the same calm voice. "Take up her meals, keep the door closed, and let the rest of us have one afternoon. You cannot allow that child's illness to control every person in the family." I stared at the laundry room door. My parents had visited Willa in the hospital only twice, but I had sent them updates after every important appointment. They knew why we wore masks in public. They knew why visitors had to be approved. They knew I had spent days cleaning the farmhouse before bringing her home. Until that moment, some part of me had still believed they did not understand. Now I knew they understood perfectly well. They simply believed their anniversary mattered more. "She is not controlling anyone," I said. "She is recovering from a bone marrow transplant." My father made an impatient sound. 40 people have kept Saturday open. Some have arranged transportation. Your mother has already spoken with the caterer. We are not canceling everything because of one fear." "It is not one fear. It is medical instruction." "You have always known how to make your preferences sound like emergencies," he replied. That sentence pulled me back through years of conversations. When I did not want relatives arriving without warning, I was inflexible. When I would not loan money, I was suspicious. When Daniel and I refused to give my parents a permanent key to the farmhouse, I was treating them like strangers. My mother had spent years teaching me that a boundary became selfish the moment it inconvenienced her. My father had spent those same years calling her demands misunderstandings. I realized another explanation would only give them more words to rearrange later. I told them, "All right," then ended the call before either of them could answer. My mother believed those words meant she had won. In our family, They usually meant I had become too exhausted to continue. This time, they meant I was finished asking people to respect a decision they had no authority to overrule. I opened the family message and took screenshots of the entire exchange, including my original refusal and my father's statement that arrangements had already been made. I saved the images in a folder on my computer and sent copies to a private email account. Then I wrote a new message to both of my parents. I am confirming in writing that I have not given permission for an anniversary party or any other gathering at my farmhouse. Willa cannot be exposed to crowds during her recovery. No person may enter the house, yard, barn, or driveway for this event without my written consent. My answer remains no. I read it twice before pressing send. My father responded almost immediately. "This is unnecessary." I did not reply. When I returned to the living room, Willa had lowered the volume on the television. She was still beneath the blanket, but her attention was no longer on the game show. "Were you talking to Grandma?" I sat beside her. "Yes." Her fingers folded the edge of the blanket into a narrow strip. "I heard something about upstairs." I wished I could tell her she had misunderstood. During the months of treatment, I had learned how often adults protected children by offering explanations that children already knew were false. Willa did not need every ugly detail, but she deserved not to be lied to inside her own home. "They wanted to hold their anniversary party here," I said. "I told them that was not possible, and Grandma suggested keeping you upstairs." Willa looked toward the ceiling, as though imagining the house divided into two parts. One for the people celebrating below, and one for the person they considered inconvenient above. She did not cry. She only asked, would they still want the farmhouse if I were not sick? The question hurt because she was trying to calculate whether her illness had caused the conflict. She had spent enough time watching adults discuss schedules, bills, hospital rules, and missed events. She understood that her treatment had changed our lives, but she had begun to confuse change with blame. "This is not happening because you are sick," I said. "It is happening because they were told no, and decided your safety was less important than getting what they wanted. But if I were better, they could have the party. If you were completely healthy, they would still need to ask. This is our home. It is not a prize that becomes available when you need less care." She studied my face. "Are they angry with me?" "They are angry with me because I made the decision. You are not responsible for managing their feelings." Willa leaned against the cushions. She looked tired again, and I regretted that the first day she had spent at home already required her to wonder whether she belonged in it. I helped her take her evening medication, checked her temperature, and waited until she was settled before calling the transplant center's after-hours line. A nurse took my information, then Dr. Patel returned the call 20 minutes later. I described the proposed gathering and asked whether there was any safe arrangement involving Willa remaining upstairs. "There is no reason to create that exposure," he said. "She has only just been discharged. This is not the time to compromise because relatives are applying pressure." Relief and shame arrived together. Relief because a physician had confirmed what I already knew. Shame because my parents had pushed me far enough that I felt compelled to ask. "I know the answer," I said. "I think I needed to hear someone else say it. That is what pressure does. It makes clear decisions feel unreasonable." He agreed to send a brief letter confirming that Willa needed to avoid crowds and unauthorized visitors during the early recovery period. He did not mention my parents or their anniversary. The letter would state the medical boundary, without turning a family dispute into a diagnosis. After the call, I contacted the non-emergency number for the county sheriff's office. I had worked as a scheduling coordinator before moving into bookkeeping, so I knew the difference between reporting a concern and demanding action before anything had happened. I told the dispatcher that I owned the farmhouse, that relatives had announced an event without permission, and that I wanted to document my written refusal. She advised me to keep all communication, post a clear private property notice if necessary, and call again if anyone attempted to enter after being told not to. If there were an active attempt to force entry, I should call 911. I wrote down her name and the time of the call. Before going to bed, I checked my phone once more. There were no new messages from my parents, but my Aunt Eleanor had sent me a photograph. "I thought you should see the invitation," she wrote. "Marjorie said you were helping with everything." The electronic invitation showed a watercolor image of my porch beneath gold lettering. The farmhouse was identified as the Reed family farm, using my parents' last name instead of mine or Daniel's. Beneath the anniversary schedule, guests were asked to prepare a brief memory about Marjorie and Walter's devotion to Willa during her illness. My parents had visited her twice. I enlarged the image and read the final item on the program. Family reconciliation film, 3:3 p.m. I had never agreed to a reconciliation, and I had no idea why one needed to be filmed. I called Aunt Eleanor before I could convince myself there might be an innocent explanation for the words, "family reconciliation film." She answered cheerfully and asked whether Willa was excited about Saturday. Her question confirmed that my mother had not merely announced the party without permission. She had built an entirely different version of reality for the guests. "What exactly did Mom tell you?" I asked. Eleanor hesitated. "She said Willa's doctors had approved a limited family gathering. She also said you wanted the anniversary to become a fresh start after everything your family had been through." "Did she tell you I agreed to 40 guests?" "She said you were nervous, but that you had finally said all right." My mother had taken 2 words spoken after she suggested locking my daughter upstairs and turned them into consent. Eleanor continued before I could respond. "Marjorie said the details were being kept from you and Willa because the film was supposed to be a surprise. I thought it was something you wanted, Grace. A gift for both of you." I could hear embarrassment entering her voice. She had not invented the lie, and shaming her would only make her defend the person who had told it. "I understand why you believed her," I said. "Please forward everything she sent you. I need the complete email, the schedule, and any instructions for guests." Eleanor agreed, though she still sounded uncertain. "Are you saying there will be no party?" "I am saying I never gave permission for one." Within 10 minutes, 3 emails arrived. The first contained the electronic invitation I had already seen. The second was a schedule beginning with guest arrival at 11 and ending with a champagne toast shortly after 4. The film was scheduled between the anniversary speech and the cutting of the cake. Guests were told to remain in their assigned places because a professional videographer would be recording the family's emotional reunion. The third email contained instructions written in my mother's careful, polished language. Guests were asked not to contact me about the surprise. They were told I had been under severe emotional pressure since Daniel's death and Willa's illness. If I appeared overwhelmed, they should remain calm, avoid arguing with me, and allow Marjorie and Walter to guide the reunion. My mother had prepared everyone to interpret my refusal as instability before I had spoken to a single guest. One line asked guests to think of examples, showing that my parents had always been a steady and loving presence in Willa's life. Another instructed them not to leave immediately if I became resistant to reconciliation. I saved each email with its original date and sender information. Then I printed copies and placed them beside the written refusal I had already sent my parents. The more organized the plan appeared, the less it resembled an anniversary party that had simply lost its venue. My phone rang while I was still reading. The caller identified herself as Tessa Grant. "Mrs. Holloway, I am filming the Reed anniversary on Saturday," she said. "I need to confirm when you want the driveway opened and where I can connect power for the equipment." "I do not want the driveway opened." There was a short silence. "I may have the wrong contact person. You have the right property owner. There is no authorized event at my home." Tessa lowered her voice. "Marjorie listed you as the family host. She said you might be difficult to reach because you were caring for your daughter. She was told in writing that no one has permission to enter the property." I heard papers moving on the other end of the call. "I need to look at my service description," she said. "Can you wait a moment?" When she returned, she sounded less confident. "The filming schedule says I begin with exterior shots before the guests arrive. Then there is a welcome scene at the porch. Who is supposed to welcome them?" You are. I asked her to read the exact wording. Grace welcomes parents to the family home. Willa embraces grandparents after separation. Family testimony follows initial resistance. The first two lines were disturbing. The third made my skin go cold. What does after initial resistance mean? Tessa paused again. I asked the same thing when I received the assignment. Marjorie said you had experienced a difficult few years and could become emotional when surprised. She instructed me not to stop filming, if you objected at first. Did she explain why? She said the family needed an honest record of the entire healing process, not only the pleasant parts. My mother did not merely expect me to protest. She had hired someone to preserve that protest. Tessa, my daughter has just returned from a bone marrow transplant. Her medical team has prohibited crowds. My parents know this, and I have not agreed to any reunion. I understand what you are telling me, she replied. But I need to review my contract before I say anything else. I was hired to document an anniversary, not become involved in a family dispute. Her caution frustrated me, but it also made sense. She did not know me, and she had received a professional agreement from a paying client. I did not need her to become my defender. I needed her not to enter my property under false information. Please review it, I said. I will send you my written notice that the event is unauthorized. I will confirm that I received it, but I cannot promise anything beyond that until I speak with my business advisor. After we ended the call, I sent the notice and saved her response acknowledging it. Willa appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying an old tablet against her chest. She had changed into clean pajamas and tied a scarf loosely around her head. Mom, I think you should see something. I closed the folder before she sat down. She placed the tablet on the table and opened a message thread I had never seen. The messages were from my parents. Marjorie had begun writing to Willa during the hospital stay, asking whether she felt lonely and whether I allowed her to speak privately with relatives. At first, the questions looked gentle enough, then they changed. Do you ever feel trapped because your mother worries too much? Would you feel safer recovering at our house? Do you think you should be old enough to choose who visits you? Has your mother told you that you are not allowed to see us? Willa had answered only a few times. She told them she was tired, that the hospital had rules, and that she wanted to go home with me. My father replied that children sometimes protected a parent, even when the parent was making poor decisions. The wording did not sound like grandparents checking on a sick child. It sounded like questions designed to produce particular answers. How long have they been sending these? I asked. Since before the transplant. Why didn't you tell me? Willa looked down at the screen. You were already doing everything. I thought if I ignored them, they would stop. She had muted the notifications so I would not hear them while we were in the hospital. My 15-year-old daughter had been receiving medication, preparing for a transplant, and quietly managing my parents because she thought protecting me was another task she needed to carry. You never have to hide something like this to make my life easier, I said. I knew you would worry. I am your mother. Worrying about pressure placed on you is part of my job. She gave me a small, tired smile. That sounds exhausting. It can be. It is still not your responsibility. I did not read every message then. Willa had already given me enough to understand their pattern, and I did not want to turn her recovery into an interrogation. I photographed the thread, recorded the dates, and placed the tablet in my desk drawer with her permission. My mother called an hour later. Her voice had changed. The commands were gone, replaced by wounded patience. Grace, you are alarming people who are only trying to help us heal. You hired a videographer to record me after I resisted an event I never approved. I hired someone to preserve an important family moment. You told her to continue filming if I objected. Because you often react before you understand what is being offered. I looked at the stack of printed emails. Cancel the party and the filming. You do not get to control every relationship Willa has. I decide who enters my property, and I follow her medical team's instructions. She is 15, Grace. She has thoughts and feelings separate from yours. I know she does. That is why I asked what she wanted instead of sending her questions designed to make her accuse me of isolating her. For the first time, my mother lost the softness in her voice. You had no right to read private conversations between Willa and her grandparents. She brought them to me. Another silence followed. My mother had not expected Willa to show me. You have kept that child inside your fear since Daniel died, she said. Sooner or later, someone has to ask whether this is still protection. I ended the call without answering. Near 5 that evening, a dark sedan stopped outside the gate. A man stepped out holding a thick envelope and asked whether I was Grace Holloway. He did not try to enter the property. He confirmed my identity from the other side of the gate, handed me the documents, and told me I had been served. The first page was titled Complaint for Grandparent Companionship or Visitation. Behind it was a motion for temporary visitation. My parents accused me of using Daniel's death and Willa's illness to cut them out of her life. They listed the hospital visits I had refused, the calls I had limited when Willa was too weak to speak, and the surprise visitors I had kept away from the transplant floor. None of the documents claimed Saturday had already happened. They did not need to make that mistake. Attached to the complaint was a screenshot of my conversation with my mother. It showed her announcement that 40 guests were coming, followed by my reply. All right. The image ended there. It did not include her instruction to lock Willa upstairs. It did not include my written refusal. It did not include the warning that no one had permission to enter the farmhouse. I placed the cropped image beside the full conversation and finally understood why my mother needed a camera, an audience, and a daughter she expected to resist. The complaint contained accusations, but not enough proof. Saturday was never meant to celebrate a marriage or repair a family. It was meant to manufacture the evidence my parents did not yet have. The next morning, I carried the court papers into Lena Ortiz's office with the full message thread, Eleanor's forwarded emails, Dr. Patel's discharge instructions, and photographs of the messages my parents had sent Willa. Lena was a family law attorney recommended through a legal assistance program connected with the transplant center. Her office was small and practical, with 2 filing cabinets, a crowded bookshelf, and no framed promises about winning impossible cases. She read the complaint without interrupting me. When she reached the cropped image showing my mother's announcement and my reply, she placed it beside the complete conversation on my phone. They removed everything before and after all right, she said. They left out the part where she told me to lock Willa upstairs. They also left out your written refusal and the notice that no one had permission to enter the property. I asked whether the omissions were enough to make the case disappear. Lena shook her head. Courts do not usually decide family cases from one screenshot. Your parents have alleged a longer pattern. They say you restricted contact after Daniel died, refused hospital visits, and used Willa's medical condition to prevent a relationship with them. They arrived at the hospital with people I had never approved. I believe you. We still need to answer every allegation with dates and context. She explained why the court had accepted the filing. Willa had been born before Daniel and I married. Daniel had acknowledged that he was her father, and we married 2 years later, but the circumstances of her birth gave my parents a legal path to ask an Ohio court to consider companionship or visitation. That did not mean they had already earned it. It gives them permission to ask, Lena said. It does not give them an automatic right to enter your home, ignore medical instructions, or decide when Willa must see them. I had spent the night fearing that receiving court papers meant I had already lost some part of my authority as Willa's mother. Hearing the distinction steadied me, but it did not remove the danger. Lena tapped the proposed filming schedule. This complaint has accusations, but very little independent support. They have their own statements, a cropped message, and examples of visits you refused. Saturday appears designed to give them what they do not yet have. A recording of me refusing them, preferably while 40 people watch. The trap became clearer when she explained how each possible response could be used. If I opened the gate, I would expose Willa's recovery environment to a crowd and weaken my claim that the medical restrictions were necessary. If I confronted my parents angrily in front of the camera, they could present the footage as proof that grief and fear had made me irrational. If I stayed inside and refused to speak, they could film a closed door while 40 guests describe themselves as a loving family being denied access. They have designed a situation where every reaction can be edited into their story, Lena said. What am I supposed to do? We remove Willa from the danger. We communicate only in writing. We document every reasonable alternative you offer, and we do not perform for their camera. She did not promise to destroy my parents in court. She did not say the judge would recognize the truth the moment the documents were opened. Instead, she explained what she could do under a limited scope retainer. She would prepare the response to the emergency motion, organize the evidence, communicate formal proposals to my parents, and help me preserve the difference between medical protection and family isolation. The fee was not small, but it was possible. Daniel and I had built an emergency fund during the years when his construction work was unpredictable. I had used part of it after his death, and more during Willa's treatment, but enough remained to pay the initial retainer. I signed the agreement without pretending the expense did not frighten me. My parents had created a crisis, and defending my daughter from it now cost money that Daniel and I had saved for emergencies we never imagined. When I returned home, Willa was sitting at the kitchen table with a puzzle book and a cup of tea she had allowed to go cold. I sat across from her and kept my voice neutral. I need to ask you something, and there is no answer you are supposed to give me. Her pencil stopped moving. Do you want to see Grandma and Grandpa right now? She looked toward the window before answering. I miss how they used to be. I waited. I miss making Christmas cookies with Grandma. I miss Grandpa teaching me card games and pretending he did not let me win. She rubbed the eraser with her thumb. But I do not want to see the people who keep asking whether you have trapped me. That is enough of an answer. I might want to see them later. You are allowed to change your mind later. She looked relieved that I had not asked her to choose between loving them and being afraid of what they were doing. I do not want 40 people here, she said. I do not want everyone looking at me like I am evidence. I reached across the table and covered her hand. You will not be here when they arrive. Her expression changed immediately. Are we leaving our house because of them? For one weekend. The transplant center has a family apartment near the hospital. They use it when patients need follow-up care or when home is temporarily unsafe. This house is not unsafe. The people planning to enter it without permission are the danger. Leaving for 2 nights does not give them the house. It keeps you away from what they are trying to create. She did not like the answer, but she understood it. That afternoon, Lena sent my parents a written proposal. Willa would participate in a brief supervised video call on their anniversary if she felt well enough. After Dr. Patel approved an in-person visit, I would consider arranging a short meeting with only Marjorie and Walter, provided they followed every medical requirement. The proposal gave them what they claimed to want: contact with their granddaughter, acknowledgement of their anniversary, and a path toward a future visit. My mother rejected it within 20 minutes. A video call is not a family reconciliation, she wrote. 40 people are already coming, and we will not explain your behavior to them again. Lena forwarded the response to me with one sentence. They have now rejected a medically safe alternative. My mother's refusal did not surprise me, but it clarified what Willa and I had never been meant to provide. This was not about seeing their granddaughter. A private call could not produce an audience, a dramatic confrontation, or footage of me standing against an entire family. Dr. Patel's letter arrived before the end of the day. It was less than 1 page, and used language any judge could understand. Willa was in an early and medically vulnerable stage of recovery, following a bone marrow transplant. Exposure to a large gathering created an avoidable risk of infection. Preventing 40 visitors from entering her residence was consistent with appropriate care and should not be interpreted as arbitrary social isolation. I printed 3 copies. The transplant coordinator also confirmed that a subsidized family apartment near the hospital would be available from Friday afternoon through Sunday. It was not luxurious, but it was clean, close to emergency care, and designed for families living under the same restrictions we were. With Lena's help, I sent a final notice to my parents by email, text message, and certified mail. No anniversary event was authorized. No guest, vendor, relative, or contractor had permission to enter the driveway, yard, barn, porch, or farmhouse. Any attempt to enter after receiving the notice would be reported. I changed the code on the electronic locks that evening. I did not replace doors, stack furniture against windows, or turn the house into a fortress. I removed a code my parents should never have continued using and protected the environment where my daughter was supposed to heal. The certified message showed as delivered the following morning. My mother did not respond. My father did. We will see what 40 witnesses think. I read the sentence twice, then sent it to Lena. Until then, part of me had wondered whether I was assigning too much purpose to their anniversary plans. Walter's message ended that doubt. They were not bringing 40 people because the guests had nowhere else to celebrate. They were bringing 40 witnesses because they believed enough eyes could turn a lie into evidence. On Friday afternoon, Willa stood in the middle of her bedroom with a canvas bag at her feet and looked at me as though I had asked her to return to the hospital. The family apartment near the transplant center was only 20 minutes away, and we would be gone for 2 nights at most. None of that made leaving our home feel fair. Why do we have to go when they are the ones breaking the rules? She asked. We are not giving them the house, I said. We are keeping you away from a situation they have already warned us they intend to create. It still feels like they are making us leave. I could not tell her she was wrong. My parents had not crossed the gate, yet their decisions were already changing where Willa slept and what she packed. She placed her journal, days back home, inside the bag. Doctor Patel had suggested she write down one ordinary thing she noticed each day, so recovery would not become a record made entirely of temperatures, medications, and appointments. Beside the journal, she packed a small potted succulent that Daniel had given her years earlier. You do not need to bring the plant for 2 nights, I said. It has been alone enough. I carried the bag downstairs without arguing. The apartment was clean and quiet, with 2 small bedrooms and a kitchen stocked with sealed dishes. A transplant coordinator had checked the space that morning. Willa would remain there with my friend Ruth while I returned to the farmhouse to secure the house and collect the medication I had left in the locked refrigerator compartment. Ruth had known me for 15 years and understood that her job was not to solve the conflict. She would stay with Willa, follow the medication schedule, and call me or the transplant center if anything changed. Before I left, Willa caught my sleeve. You are coming back tonight? As soon as I know the house is secure. Do not let Grandma make you think you are doing something cruel. The words stopped me. During most of her life, I had believed it was my responsibility to protect Willa from adult conflict. Now she was trying to protect me from the guilt my mother had spent years teaching me to feel. I know what I am doing, I said. You do not have to take care of me. I know. I just wanted you to remember. I promised I would. Ruth followed me into the hallway and asked whether I wanted her husband to come to the farmhouse. No. The written notice is clear, and the sheriff's office already has a record of the situation. I only need someone to know where I am. She made me promise to call when I arrived and when I left. By 6, I was back at the farmhouse. The rooms were exactly as Willa and I had left them, but the quiet no longer felt restful. It felt like the pause before someone tested whether my word had any weight. I checked the electronic locks, the exterior cameras, and the alarm on the medication refrigerator. I replaced the filters in the portable air units because I did not want to return on Sunday and discover that preparation for the conflict had made me neglect the reason the house had been cleaned in the first place. At 6:40, a white van stopped outside the gate. A woman stepped out, carrying 2 camera cases. I recognized Tessa from the profile photograph attached to her business email. I met her at the gate with a printed copy of the notice denying permission for the event. Marjorie told me the disagreement had been resolved, she said. It has not. Tessa read the notice carefully, Her gaze moved from my signature to the certified delivery confirmation attached behind it. I was told to arrive early and record exterior footage before the setup crew came. No vendor has permission to enter. She looked toward the farmhouse and then back at her van. I spoke with my business advisor after our call, she said. Without the property owner's consent, I cannot set up equipment here. I also cannot film through the gate, if the purpose is to provoke a private confrontation. Thank you. I am not taking a side, Mrs. Holloway. I am protecting my business. That is all I am asking you to do. Tessa said she would notify Marjorie that the assignment could not proceed as described. She also promised to send me the original filming instructions after confirming she was legally permitted to share them. Before leaving, she glanced at the upstairs window. Your daughter is not here, is she? No. She nodded once. That is probably best. I watched her van disappear down the road, then called Ruth. Willa's temperature was normal, and she was drawing the view from the apartment window in her journal. For the next 2 hours, nothing happened. I heated soup, reviewed the documents Lena had organized, and tried not to check the camera feed every few minutes. My parents had received the certified notice. Tessa had refused the assignment. The farmhouse was locked, and Willa was safe. At 8:58, my phone vibrated. The doorbell camera showed my parents standing outside the side entrance. A gray pickup truck was parked behind them, followed by a box van containing folding tables, lighting stands, and several cardboard containers printed with individual names. A third man stood beside the door wearing a work jacket. A locksmith's case rested near his feet. I called Ruth before approaching the entrance. They are here. Keep the door locked at the apartment and do not tell Willa unless she asks. Do you want me to call someone? Not yet. I will call if they attempt to enter. I walked to the side door but left it closed. My mother knocked twice. Grace, open the door. We need to prepare before morning. You have written notice that no event is authorized. We are not holding the party tonight, she said. We are only setting up. You do not have permission to set up. My father stepped closer to the door. This is family property, and you are deliberately creating unnecessary conflict. The deed is in my name. You have been told not to enter. Walter turned to the locksmith. Open it. The man did not touch his equipment. I need identification and proof that you are authorized to enter this address. Walter held out his driver's license. The locksmith examined it. This address is different. I am her father. Our family has used this house for years. That does not show ownership or residency. My mother pointed toward the closed door. She is emotionally distressed. We have a court matter involving our granddaughter, and she is trying to keep us from preparing a family gathering. The locksmith looked at the door. Is the property owner inside? Yes, I answered through the door. I am Grace Holloway. I own this house, and I do not authorize anyone to open or alter the lock. The man immediately closed his case. I cannot perform the service under these circumstances. Walter's voice hardened. We drove all the way here because you said you could open a door. I said I could provide service after authorization was verified. My father accused him of taking my side. The locksmith repeated that he would not continue and carried his case back toward his vehicle. My mother moved close enough to the camera that her face filled the screen beside the door. You are making yourself look unreasonable before this case has even begun. I am enforcing the notice you received. 40 people will be here tomorrow. Do you plan to hide from all of them? I plan to keep this property closed. Walter walked to the box van and opened the rear doors. For a moment, I thought he intended to leave. Instead, he removed a short pry bar from a tool bag. The locksmith saw it and called out from beside his vehicle. Sir, do not use that on the door. Walter ignored him. I opened the camera application and began recording from the second exterior angle. Then I spoke through the closed door. Dad, you do not have permission to enter. Put the tool down and leave the property. He wedged the end of the pry bar between the frame and the door. You changed the code to keep your own parents out. I changed the code because this is not your home. He pulled once. The wooden frame gave a sharp crack. I called 911. The dispatcher asked for my address, the number of people present, and whether anyone had a weapon. I told her my father was using a metal pry bar against a side entrance after receiving written notice that he was not permitted on the property. "Are you inside the house now?" she asked. "Yes. The door is locked. My daughter is not here. Do not confront him outside. Officers are on the way." I stayed on the line and described Walter's clothing, the vehicles, and the location of the entrance. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Years of coordinating emergencies for other people had taught me that panic used time without providing information. Walter struck the frame again. My mother stood behind him, telling him to be careful not to damage the door before the guests arrived. The first patrol vehicle reached the driveway within 9 minutes. Sheriff Calvin Ross arrived directly behind it. He ordered Walter to step away and place the pry bar on the ground. My father obeyed, though he continued insisting that the dispute was a private family matter. I opened the door only after Sheriff Ross told me it was safe. The locksmith showed him his identification and explained that he had refused the service as soon as I denied authorization. He confirmed that Walter had taken the pry bar from his own vehicle after being told not to proceed. I gave Sheriff Ross the deed copy, the certified notice, and the messages stating that my parents intended to return with 40 people. He inspected the damaged frame, then addressed Walter and Marjorie. "You have been informed by the owner that you are not permitted on this property. Tonight's incident is now documented. If you return without authorization, you may be cited or arrested for criminal trespass." My mother folded her arms. "She is doing this to influence the visitation case." Sheriff Ross did not respond to the accusation. He repeated the warning and instructed them to remove the vans and all equipment from the driveway. Walter looked toward the farmhouse. "The guests are still coming tomorrow." My mother added, "You cannot stop 40 people from standing with a family." Sheriff Ross told them that because they had announced their intention to return with a crowd after a forced entry attempt, a unit would be present at the expected arrival time to prevent another violation and keep the road clear. My parents left shortly before 10:30. The locksmith remained long enough to give me his contact information in case a statement was needed. I sent the camera recordings and photographs of the damaged frame to Lena. Then I called Ruth and told Willa only that the house was secure and I would join her soon. As I prepared to leave, an email from Tessa appeared on my phone. She had attached a screenshot of the original instructions from my mother. The final line read, "The most important footage will be Grace refusing the family. Continue recording if she becomes angry or loses control." I looked at the cracked door frame and understood that my mother had expected a breakdown. By morning, she intended to bring 40 people to help her create one. At 7 minutes past 11 on Saturday morning, the first car turned onto my gravel road. I was standing on the farmhouse porch with Sheriff Calvin Ross when Ruth texted to say Willa's temperature was normal. She had eaten breakfast, taken her medication, and was drawing the hospital courtyard from the apartment window. Knowing she was safe did not make the line of vehicles easier to watch. Within minutes, cars filled the shoulder outside the gate. A rented shuttle stopped behind them, and people began stepping out in clothes suited for a church anniversary dinner. Some carried wrapped gifts, others balanced casserole dishes or flower arrangements against their hips. Several guests wore masks. My mother had apparently told them Willa might appear briefly from an upstairs window or wave from a distance. The masks made some of them look considerate, but they also proved how carefully Marjorie had blended small pieces of truth into the larger lie. These were not 40 cruel people arriving to endanger a sick child. Most of them believed they had been invited to a medically approved family celebration. That was what made the scene dangerous. My mother stepped from my father's car holding a white anniversary cake. Gold sugar flowers circled the top, and a ribbon around the box carried the words 40 years together. She did not look toward the damaged side entrance or ask whether Willa was well. She turned first toward the guests, then toward the farmhouse, searching for Tessa's camera. When she saw the sheriff beside me, she adjusted her expression before walking to the gate. "Grace," she called, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Please tell the sheriff there has been a misunderstanding. These people came because you invited them." The conversations behind her quieted. I stayed on the porch. "I did not invite anyone," I said. "You received written notice that no event was authorized here." My mother looked over her shoulder at the guests, as though I had embarrassed her by changing a restaurant reservation. "She has been under tremendous strain," she told them. "Some days she agrees to things, then fear takes over." Walter moved beside her. "Calling law enforcement on two elderly parents during their anniversary is a humiliation no family should have to endure." Sheriff Ross did not respond to the performance. He stood where everyone could see him and kept his voice even. "The owner of this property denied permission for the gathering. There was also an attempted forced entry here last night, after that denial was delivered in writing." A murmur passed through the group. My mother lifted the cake slightly, as though the sight of it disproved the damaged doorframe. "No one forced entry. Walter tried to prepare a home our family has used for years." "The matter was documented," Sheriff Ross said. "No one may enter the driveway, yard, porch, barn, or residence without Mrs. Holloway's permission." One of my father's cousins stepped forward. "Grace, your parents are not strangers. You could let everyone stand in the yard for an hour." "The yard is part of Willa's recovery environment," I said. "No gathering was approved here." A woman from my mother's church raised her hand as though we were in a meeting. "Marjorie told us the transplant doctor agreed to a short outdoor visit." "He did not." The woman looked at my mother. Marjorie did not answer her directly. She turned toward the shuttle and said the guests had already traveled too far to be sent away because of another misunderstanding. Aunt Eleanor stood near the rear of the group. She held a gift bag and kept looking between my mother and me. When our eyes met, she lowered hers. My mother had lied to her, but Eleanor had repeated the lie to other people before checking with me. Shame had not yet decided whether it would become honesty or defensiveness. My father walked along the gate, inspecting the sheriff's vehicle and the temporary no-entry sign beside the latch. "Is this really necessary?" he asked Sheriff Ross. "She has turned a family disagreement into a police spectacle. The attempted entry made law enforcement necessary." Sheriff Ross replied. "The crowd did not arrive because Mrs. Holloway requested it." That answer displeased Walter more than an argument would have. He could challenge an accusation, but Sheriff Ross had given him only a sequence of facts. A white van appeared at the end of the line. Tessa parked away from the driveway and approached carrying no equipment. My mother immediately waved her forward. "Start recording," Marjorie said. "People need to see what she is doing." Tessa stopped outside the gate. "I will not film on or into private property without the owner's consent. You were paid to document our anniversary." I was hired under the representation that the homeowner had approved the event. She did not. My mother's face tightened. "Grace contacted you privately and pressured you." "Mrs. Holloway sent me a written notice. I reviewed it with my business advisor." "You took her side before hearing ours." "I made a decision about where I am legally and professionally allowed to record." Tessa's refusal was calm, but my mother treated it like betrayal. She told the guests that I had frightened a young business owner into breaking a valid agreement. Tessa did not defend her character or explain every conversation we had shared. She simply repeated that she would not set up her cameras. The scene my parents had planned was beginning to change, but not everyone understood why. Two relatives asked whether the party could move to a nearby park. Someone suggested the church fellowship hall. Another woman complained that the food would spoil if no one made a quick decision. My mother rejected each suggestion. "This is supposed to happen here," she said. "This house represents our family." "It represents Grace and Daniel," Eleanor said quietly. My mother turned toward her. Eleanor's voice had not been loud, but the people nearest her heard it. "Daniel and Grace bought this place," she continued. "You told us Grace wanted the reconciliation here because it was meaningful to her." "It is meaningful to all of us," my mother replied. That is not the same thing. Eleanor looked down at the gift bag in her hand, then reached inside and removed a sealed cream-colored envelope. My name was not written on it. A printed label carried Eleanor's full name. She walked toward the gate. Marjorie gave us these last night, she said. She said we were supposed to sign them after the cake. My mother moved quickly. That is part of the anniversary program. It has nothing to do with Grace. Eleanor stopped a few feet from Sheriff Ross. She called it a family memory statement. My mother set the cake on the hood of Walter's car. Eleanor, do not hand private family papers to the police. I am handing it to Grace. Eleanor passed the envelope through the bars of the gate. The paper inside had the appearance of a formal statement. There were blank spaces for the guest's name, address, signature, and relationship to my parents. The paragraphs beneath them were not memories. They described the writer as a witness to my refusal to allow reasonable contact between Willa and her grandparents. The person signing was asked to confirm that I had used Willa's medical condition to punish my parents and isolate my daughter from a loving family. I kept reading. Another section stated that I had become agitated when my parents arrived, shouted accusations in front of the guests, and refused every peaceful attempt to resolve the disagreement. None of that had happened. The form continued. It said Willa had been seen crying through an upstairs window while I prevented her from coming down. It said Sheriff Ross had been required to restrain me after I lost emotional control. Willa was 20 minutes away in a protected apartment. I had not shouted. Sheriff Ross had never touched me. The document did not ask Eleanor to describe what she witnessed. It told her what she was expected to claim she had witnessed. My hands remained steady because the words were so calculated that they pushed me beyond surprise. I looked toward the vehicles from the night before. The boxes Walter had brought to the side entrance had been marked with individual names. There had not been one draft. There had been 40 prepared statements, waiting for 40 signatures. My mother reached through the gate. Give that back. Eleanor was not authorized to share it. I moved the page out of her reach. What is this? It is a preliminary draft our attorney prepared in case the situation became relevant. Her answer caused several guests to look at one another. You said it was a family memory, Eleanor replied. It can be both. People were going to write honestly about what they saw. It says what I saw before I saw anything. My mother's control slipped for less than a second. The language was prepared to help people organize their thoughts. It says Willa cried from an upstairs window, I said. Willa is not in this house. Marjorie looked toward the second floor, as if my words had revealed something she had not expected. Two relatives still argued that I should open the gate and end the conflict privately. One said all families made mistakes and that embarrassing my parents in front of their friends would only hurt Willa later. Others had become silent. A woman who had brought a covered dish placed it back in her car. A man near the shuttle took out his phone and began rereading the invitation. Eleanor stood outside the gate with tears in her eyes, but she did not ask me to comfort her. Sheriff Ross requested permission to photograph the statement. Eleanor said yes because it had been addressed and delivered to her. My mother protested that the document was privileged. Sheriff Ross told her he was only documenting material voluntarily provided by its recipient and would not debate her legal case at the gate. I read the final line again. It asked the signer to certify that the statement was true, to the best of their knowledge, and could be presented in court. The anniversary cake, the camera, the invitation, and the 40 guests had never been separate parts of a celebration. They were parts of an evidence factory. My parents had prepared the memories before creating the event. I folded the statement once and looked at the guests. I no longer needed to persuade them that my mother had lied. I needed to make 3 facts clear, then let them decide whether they were willing to sign their names beneath a story written before they arrived. I asked Sheriff Ross whether I could place a folding table just inside the gate. My mother stared at me, waiting for the breakdown she had promised everyone. Instead, I went inside to bring out the documents she had hoped no one would ever read beside her own. I returned to the porch carrying a folding table beneath one arm and a document folder against my chest. Sheriff Ross opened the gate, only far enough for me to place the table inside the property line. I set down 3 documents where anyone standing outside could read them without entering. The first was Dr. Patel's letter confirming that a gathering of 40 people created an avoidable medical risk during Willa's recovery. The second was the written notice my parents had received before attempting to enter the farmhouse. The third was the video call proposal they had rejected. I did not read the papers aloud or ask the guests to choose between my mother and me. I gave them 3 facts. Willa is not inside this house. Her doctor did not approve this gathering. I never gave permission for an event on this property. My mother stared at the table. You arranged all of this to make us look dangerous. I arranged for Willa to be somewhere safe. You took her away before her own grandparents could see her. I offered you a supervised video call. You refused. That was not what we asked for. Several guests moved closer to the gate. One woman read Dr. Patel's letter while her husband compared the dates on my written notice with the date printed on Eleanor's statement. The pages did not require anyone to trust my tone or understand our history. They showed that my parents knew the medical restriction, received a safe alternative, and announced the gathering anyway. Marjorie realized the conversation was moving beyond her control. She turned toward the guests and lifted her voice. This is what Grace does. She reduces an entire family to documents and rules. She did the same thing when Daniel was alive. She made him choose between his wife and everyone who had loved him before she came along. Daniel's name struck the place she intended it to. For 3 years, I had carried private questions about whether his life would have been easier if I had surrendered more often. He had defended our home, our marriage, and Willa's needs. But my mother had always described his support as evidence that I controlled him. She knew grief could make an old accusation feel newly possible. The guests waited for me to defend my marriage. My mother waited for me to tell her what Daniel had said about her after she left our house, or how many evenings he had spent calming me after she called me selfish. I did not give her that argument. This is not about whether you like me, I said. This is about whether you obey a medical boundary in a home you do not own. A man near the shuttle unfolded his statement completely. Marjorie, mine says Willa was crying at the window too. Another guest removed her form from a gift bag. So does mine. The first man looked toward the empty upstairs window. How were we supposed to confirm that if Grace's daughter was not even here? My mother answered that the documents were only guides. Guides for what? Eleanor asked. Remembering something that never happened? They helped people understand the larger pattern. One of the church women shook her head. You told me this was a memory statement about your marriage. It includes memories. It says I witnessed a sheriff restrain Grace. Marjorie pressed her lips together. That wording could have been adjusted after the event. Then why did you ask us to sign after the cake without telling us it was for court? The question did not produce a dramatic silence. Instead, several private conversations began at once. Guests compared their forms. The wording was almost identical, although each page had been labeled with a different name. A few people looked embarrassed. 2 insisted that my mother had probably received bad advice and that the family should still be allowed to resolve the matter privately. One of them called across the gate. Grace, letting your parents speak with Willa for 5 minutes would end all of this. No, I said. It would teach them that enough pressure cancels a medical decision. Tessa stepped closer, keeping both hands visible and carrying no camera. I need to clarify what I was hired to record. My mother turned sharply. You have already broken our agreement. Tessa did not respond to the accusation. The service instructions described the project as a family reconciliation. They also directed me to keep filming if Grace objected and to prioritize footage showing refusal, emotional distress, and parental alienation. A guest asked whether Tessa had written those phrases. No. They were sent to me by Marjorie. You are sharing private business instructions, my mother said. I am confirming the scope of work I received because you represented the filming as a neutral anniversary video. Tessa did not call my mother a liar or claim to know what had happened in our family. She confirmed only what she could prove, then stepped back. Walter had remained beside the car during most of the exchange. He now opened the trunk and removed a speaker stand, a portable amplifier, and a coiled extension cord. My mother glanced toward him. "Set it beside the porch. Everyone needs to hear us without shouting." Sheriff Ross moved toward the gate. "Mr. Reed, you were warned last night that you are not permitted to enter this property." Walter lifted the equipment. "I am not entering the house. I am putting a speaker on the lawn and plugging it into the outside outlet. The lawn, porch, and side path are part of the property covered by that warning. This is ridiculous. It is clear. Do not cross the gate." Walter pushed open the smaller pedestrian entrance before Sheriff Ross could close it. He stepped through carrying the speaker stand and walked toward the side of the farmhouse. Sheriff Ross intercepted him several feet inside the boundary. "Put the equipment down and turn around." My father looked toward the guests. "You are going to arrest a 72-year-old man for trying to set down a speaker at his daughter's house? I am going to document that you crossed onto property after receiving repeated notice not to enter." Walter continued holding the stand, as though putting it down would mean surrendering. Sheriff Ross repeated the instruction, then guided him back toward the patrol vehicle. There was no struggle. My father did not become physically violent. He simply continued insisting that age, blood, and intention should place him above a boundary that applied to everyone else. Sheriff Ross placed him in the rear of the vehicle, while the deputy completed the criminal trespass paperwork. The speaker and cord were returned to a relative outside the gate. My mother watched the patrol car door close. Then the composure she had expected me to lose finally abandoned her. She walked among the guests and began collecting the statements. "Sign what you know is true," she told them. "You know Grace has kept us away. You know she has turned Willa against us. The exact details of this morning do not erase years of cruelty." A woman handed her form back unsigned. "I do not know any of that. I know only what you told me." "You have seen how she behaves." "I have seen her stand on her own porch while you tried to enter a house you were told to stay away from." My mother moved to another guest. "You know we love our granddaughter. That is not what the paper asks me to certify." She tried again with the church members, then with cousins who had known me since childhood. Her voice rose each time someone refused. "You do not have to agree with every word. Sign it because you understand what kind of daughter she has become." Several people returned the forms to Eleanor. Others left them on car hoods or placed them inside the cake box. Not everyone walked away from my parents. 2 relatives followed Marjorie when she moved toward Walter's car. Another told me I would regret humiliating them once Willa was old enough to judge my choices for herself. Most of the guests did not apologize. They simply left. The shuttle driver reopened the doors, and people climbed aboard carrying the food and gifts they had brought. The line of vehicles slowly disappeared from the road until the only remaining cars belonged to law enforcement: Eleanor, Tessa, and my parents. Eleanor approached the gate with her phone and a folder. "I forwarded some emails yesterday, but there are more," she said. She sent different instructions to different groups. "I should have called you before I repeated any of it." "You should have." She lowered her eyes. "I am sorry. It was not a complete repair, but it was the first apology anyone had given without asking me to make it easier for them." Eleanor sent the remaining messages to my email and gave Sheriff Ross permission to retain a copy of the form addressed to her. Tessa said she would preserve her original instructions and any unedited footage connected with the assignment. I locked the farmhouse after law enforcement left and drove back to the apartment near the hospital. Willa was sitting at the small kitchen table with Ruth when I arrived. She studied my face before asking what had happened. "The guests did not enter," I said. "The house is secure." "Does secure mean they cannot get inside?" "It means the doors are locked. The law recognizes they were told to stay away, and we know who no longer has permission to open them." She nodded slowly. Ruth left us alone, while Willa reached for the old tablet to find a card game. The screen lit before she touched the application. A new message from my mother appeared across the top. If anyone from the court asks, remember to say you feel trapped. Use that exact word so they understand. Willa looked at me, and the color drained from her face. I had already seen enough to know my parents wanted to control the story told about me. I had not yet understood how carefully they were teaching my daughter the words they wanted her to say. I asked Ruth to give us a few minutes, then sat beside Willa at the small kitchen table. The message from my mother remained across the tablet screen. If anyone from the court asks, remember to say you feel trapped. Use that exact word so they understand. Willa reached for the screen, but I placed my hand over hers. You do not have to explain anything until you are ready. I think you need to read the rest. She unlocked the tablet and opened the full conversation. The messages stretched back nearly 3 months, beginning before Willa entered the hospital for her transplant. At first, my parents had asked ordinary questions about her appetite, her nurses, and whether she was frightened. Then the questions became more deliberate. Do you feel isolated from people who love you? Does your mother allow you to make your own decisions? Are you afraid she will become upset if you disagree with her? Would you rather recover somewhere you could see more of your family? Willa's replies were brief. She had written that she was tired, that the hospital limited visitors, and that she wanted to return home with me. My mother never directly challenged those answers. She simply repeated the same ideas in slightly different forms. Sometimes children say they are fine because they are protecting a parent. You may not realize how trapped you feel until someone gives you another choice. If a judge asks, you can say you are not allowed to choose. My father's messages were less frequent, but more direct. A judge will listen to you if the adults around you refuse to listen. You are old enough to decide where you feel safest. No one can punish you for telling the truth. The words sounded supportive, until I noticed that my parents had already decided what Willa's truth should be. They were not asking how she felt. They were giving her a vocabulary and waiting for her to repeat it. I scrolled farther and found a photograph of a bedroom at my parents' house. The walls had been painted pale blue. A new bed stood beneath the window, and several of Willa's favorite novels had been arranged on a white shelf. My mother had written beneath the picture, "Your room when you are ready." Willa watched me study the photograph. "They started fixing it before my transplant," she said. "Grandma told me it was only for visits." "Did they ever ask whether you wanted a room there?" "No. She said every child needed somewhere to go when home stopped feeling safe." I remembered my mother describing the room to relatives as a loving gesture. She had never mentioned it to me. She had created a place for my daughter in her house, while privately teaching Willa to describe mine as a place of confinement. "Did you ever tell them you wanted to live there?" "No." "Did you ever tell them you were afraid of me?" Willa shook her head. "I told Grandma you checked on me too much when I was trying to sleep. I was joking. She said that was what controlling parents did." She looked ashamed, as though a complaint about interrupted sleep had given my mother permission to build a legal case. "You did nothing wrong," I said. "You are allowed to be annoyed with me. You are allowed to want privacy. None of that means you ask them to turn your words into something else." Willa closed the message thread, but did not put the tablet away. "I should have shown you sooner. You should never have been placed in this position. You barely slept in the hospital. Every time something went wrong, you had to call another person, fill out another form, or fix another problem. I thought ignoring Grandma was one less thing you would have to handle." Her answer opened a pain deeper than anger. For most of my life, I had managed my mother by withholding whatever might upset her. I softened my refusals, hid my frustration, and accepted blame because peace seemed easier to maintain when I carried the discomfort alone. Willa had watched me do that, then learned the same lesson. She had hidden pressure from me because she believed loving someone meant protecting them from the truth. "I owe you an apology," I said. "You did not send the messages." "No, but I allowed you to believe that keeping adults calm was part of your responsibility. It is not." She looked down at her hands. "You already had enough to worry about. My job is to carry the adult problems. Your job is to recover, tell me the truth, and be 15 years old whenever your body gives you the strength." What if the truth makes everything worse? The truth may make people angry. That is not the same as making things worse. I asked her whether Lena could receive copies of the messages. Willa agreed, but she did not want to appear in court or speak in front of my parents. You should not have to, I told her. We will ask that your words be handled without turning you into another performance. I photographed the remaining messages, including the bedroom picture, and saved the files by date. I did not ask Willa to explain every response or defend every sentence. The pattern was already clear. That evening, Tessa sent me a secure folder containing the original filming instructions, her emails with my mother, and the footage recorded outside the gate. One email described the purpose of the project as creating a clear record of refusal. Another instructed Tessa to keep filming if I raised my voice, cried, walked away, or attempted to stop guests from approaching the house. The footage showed my mother directing people toward the envelopes before the event had begun. Keep these with you until after Grace refuses us, she told one group. Then sign while the details are fresh. A man asked whether he should write his own description. My mother answered, "The language has already been prepared. You only need to confirm it." Tessa's camera had captured the statement clearly. There was no misunderstanding about when the papers were meant to be used, or whether the guests had written them themselves. Eleanor sent her own materials later that night. My mother had divided the guests into separate email groups and given each group a slightly different account. Church members were told Dr. Patel had approved an outdoor gathering. Relatives were told I had agreed, then become uncertain because grief made me unpredictable. Older family friends were told Willa had privately begged to see her grandparents. Eleanor had believed the version sent to relatives. She wrote a formal statement explaining what she had been told, why she attended, and what she learned at the gate. She admitted that she repeated my mother's claims without calling me first. Her statement did not ask for forgiveness or describe her actions as harmless. It simply corrected the record. Lena began arranging everything into a timeline. The surprise visits at the transplant floor came first. Then the messages sent to Willa, the cropped image of my reply, the demand for the farmhouse, my mother's instruction to lock Willa upstairs, and my written refusal. After that came the medically safe video call my parents rejected, the forced entry attempt, Walter's return after being warned, the prepared witness statements, and Tessa's unedited footage. No single document proved everything. Together, they showed a progression. My parents had not reacted badly to one disagreement. They had spent weeks trying to create the appearance that protecting Willa was the same as imprisoning her. On Sunday morning, Marjorie posted a message on social media. She did not use my name. She wrote about aging parents whose adult children used a grandchild's illness to punish the entire family. She said some people hid cruelty behind medical language and legal threats. Comments appeared beneath it from people who knew only her version. Several called the unnamed daughter heartless. One wrote that children eventually learned who had kept them from being loved. I closed the page without responding. For years, my mother had relied on the fact that I would enter every room she created and defend myself until exhaustion made me appear unreasonable. This time, the argument would not be decided by sympathy, comments, or the number of people willing to believe a grieving grandmother. It would be decided by dates, complete conversations, and unedited evidence. 3 days later, Lena called. My parents had submitted a 42-second video clip in support of their motion for temporary visitation. The clip showed my mother asking to be allowed inside, my calm refusal, and guests standing behind her with anniversary gifts. It ended before Eleanor revealed the prepared statements. There was no footage of the damaged doorframe, Walter crossing the property line, Dr. Patel's letter, or my mother instructing guests when to sign. "They are presenting it as proof that you rejected a peaceful reunion," Lena said. "Will the judge see the complete footage?" "Yes." Tessa provided the original file, and we will submit it with the timeline. I looked through the apartment doorway at Willa, resting on the couch, with her journal open beside her. My parents had spent weeks writing the words they wanted my daughter to say, the actions they wanted witnesses to remember, and the version of me they wanted a judge to see. Now both versions were going to court. Only one of them had survived, without being cut into pieces. Several weeks later, I entered the county courthouse, carrying only Willa's medical notebook and the timeline Lena had prepared. Willa remained at home with Ruth. She had already spent too much of her recovery being discussed as though she were a disputed piece of property. Lena had arranged for the messages from her tablet to be authenticated without requiring her to sit across from my parents and defend feelings they had tried to write for her. Marjorie and Walter were seated at the opposite table when I entered the courtroom. My mother wore a navy suit and held a folded handkerchief between both hands. My father stared straight ahead, his posture rigid enough to make him appear offended by the room itself. Neither of them looked at me until the judge entered. The hearing was quieter than the confrontation at the farmhouse. There were no cameras, anniversary decorations, or guests waiting to choose a side. Every person who spoke had to answer a specific question, and every document had to be considered beside the events surrounding it. My parents' attorney began by explaining why the court had authority to consider their request. Willa had been born before Daniel and I married. Daniel had formally acknowledged that he was her father, and we married 2 years later. But the circumstances of her birth allowed my parents to ask the court to consider grandparent companionship or visitation. Lena did not dispute that point. Marjorie and Walter Reed have the right to bring their request before this court, she said. That right does not guarantee the outcome they want, and it does not give them permission to manufacture evidence or ignore the medical needs of a child recovering from a bone marrow transplant. My mother's attorney described my parents as loving grandparents who had become desperate after being pushed out of Willa's life. He spoke about Christmas cookies, card games, and afternoons at their house. He said Daniel's death had made me fearful and controlling. According to him, Marjorie and Walter had acted imperfectly because they believed Willa was being isolated from the people who loved her. I did not deny that Willa had once been close to them. That was part of what made everything painful. Lena acknowledged it directly. This case is not about whether pleasant memories once existed, she said. It is about whether the grandparents' recent conduct supports safe contact in Willa's best interest now. Dr. Patel's letter and the relevant medical records were admitted without requiring him to appear. The documents stated that avoiding a gathering of 40 people was a reasonable medical precaution during Willa's early recovery. My parents' attorney suggested that an outdoor celebration with masks might have been possible. Lena placed the invitation beside my mother's messages. The proposed event included the yard, the downstairs rooms, shared bathrooms, catering staff, a videographer, and 40 guests. When Grace explained the risk, Marjorie did not offer to reduce the gathering or move it elsewhere. She suggested locking Willa upstairs. The judge read the complete conversation. My mother watched him reach the 4 words she had removed from the screenshot submitted with her complaint. Then he read my written refusal, sent after the phone call, stating that no event or visitor had permission to enter the property. The cropped screenshot was placed beside the full message chain. On one page, my reply appeared to be agreement. On the other, it sat between an instruction to confine my daughter and a written denial of permission. The judge asked my mother why the complete conversation had not been included. My daughter often agrees verbally and changes her position later, Marjorie said. I believe the shorter image showed the moment she accepted the reconciliation. She sent a written refusal immediately afterward. The judge replied, "She was under stress. Did you believe she had agreed when you received that refusal?" My mother tightened her grip on the handkerchief. I believed she would understand once the family arrived. That was her first attempt to reverse the meaning of what happened. She had not disregarded my refusal, she claimed. She had simply believed 40 people could help me recognize the decision she had already made for me. Sheriff Ross testified, without discussing our family relationship. He confirmed that I had documented the dispute before the weekend and provided proof that my parents had been told not to enter the farmhouse. He described the locksmith's refusal to open the side door after I identified myself as the owner. He then explained that Walter took a pry bar from his own vehicle and used it against the doorframe after receiving another direct warning. My father's attorney asked whether Walter had threatened to harm me. No, Sheriff Ross said. He attempted to force entry into a residence after the owner denied permission. The attorney asked whether Walter appeared confused about ownership. He said it was family property. The deed Grace provided listed Grace and her late husband. When Walter testified, he initially repeated that the farmhouse had always been used for family gatherings. Lena asked whether he had received my written notice before hiring the locksmith. He paused. Yes. Did that notice say you had permission to enter? No. But we believed our rights as grandparents were being ignored. Did you show the locksmith any document giving you a right to enter? No. After the locksmith refused, did you use your own tool against the door? Walter looked toward my mother. I was trying to open a home where my granddaughter was being kept from us. Willa was not in the house. I did not know that. You did know Grace had denied permission. My father's face hardened. Yes, I knew. It was not an apology. He did not admit that the boundary was reasonable. He admitted only that he had understood the word no before deciding it did not apply to him. Tessa testified next. She explained that she had been hired to film an anniversary and reconciliation. She confirmed that my mother's instructions emphasized capturing my refusal, my emotional reaction, and any attempt I made to stop the guests from approaching the house. The complete video was admitted. It showed Marjorie directing guests to keep their assigned envelopes until after I refused entry. It showed her telling them the language had already been prepared and they only needed to confirm it. My parents' attorney argued that the instructions were part of a documentary-style project intended to preserve an honest family moment. Then Eleanor took the witness chair. She admitted that she had believed Marjorie and attended the event expecting to support her. She described receiving a form, labeled with her name, and being told it was a family memory statement. Lena showed her the paragraphs describing me shouting, Willa crying from an upstairs window, and Sheriff Ross restraining me. Had any of those events occurred when you received this form? Lena asked. No. Was Willa inside the farmhouse that morning? No. Did Sheriff Ross restrain Grace? No. Did Marjorie tell you the statement might be used in court? Not until after I handed it to Grace. The judge asked my mother why the form described events before they happened. It was a contingency draft, Marjorie said. Our lawyer advised us to document the pattern if Grace behaved as she had behaved before. My parents' attorney shifted in his seat. The judge looked down at the page. This form does not provide space for a witness to describe what occurred. It supplies the events and asks for a signature. It was meant to help people organize their thoughts, my mother replied. About an event they had not witnessed? My mother's voice sharpened. You did not grow up with Grace. She has always reacted this way when the family challenged her. The judge glanced at the unedited video. In the recording before me, she remained on her porch and presented written documents. Which part of that conduct matches the breakdown described in your form? My mother had no answer that did not require inventing another version of the morning. The final evidence concerned the messages sent to Willa. Only the necessary portions were presented. The court saw the repeated suggestions that Willa describe herself as trapped, isolated, and unable to choose. It saw the photograph of the prepared bedroom and my mother's instruction to use the exact word trapped if anyone from the court asked. My mother said she had been giving Willa language to express feelings the girl was afraid to admit. Lena read Willa's actual responses. She wanted to recover at home with me. She did not want 40 guests. She missed the grandparents she remembered, but did not want to see them while they were pressuring her to accuse me. The hearing lasted most of the day. When the judge returned with his decision, he did not declare my parents monsters or suggest that every grandparent dispute involved manipulation. He focused on the choices Marjorie and Walter had made. They had rejected a medically safe video call. They had misrepresented the doctor's approval to guests. They had attempted to enter my property after written refusal. They had created forms describing events that had not occurred, and sent Willa messages directing her towards specific language for court. The motion for temporary visitation was denied. The complaint for grandparent companionship or visitation was also denied because the plan my parents had carried out did not serve Willa's best interests, particularly during a medically vulnerable period. The judge ordered them to pay part of the reasonable legal expenses caused by the cropped evidence and the way the event had been presented. He did not issue a broad family court restraining order. He made it clear that I retained the authority to decide contact as Willa's parent, while Walter's entry onto the farmhouse property would be addressed separately in the criminal trespass matter. I had imagined relief, arriving like a door opening. Instead, I looked across the courtroom at the two people who had raised me and felt grief settle where fear had been. Winning did not give me different parents. It only required me to stop pretending the parents I had were safer than their choices had shown them to be. Outside the courtroom, Walter walked ahead without speaking. Marjorie waited until Lena stepped aside to answer a call, then held out a sealed envelope. "This is my final explanation," she said. "You owe me enough respect to read it." I took the envelope, but I did not open it. For the first time in my life, my mother had placed her version of the truth in my hand without knowing whether I would allow it into my home. 3 months after the hearing, Dr. Patel told us Willa's recovery had reached an important milestone. She still needed regular blood work and careful monitoring, but she was no longer required to avoid every person outside our household. She could meet visitors one at a time, provided they felt well, followed the transplant team's rules, and understood that a short visit could end the moment she became tired. Willa listened closely, then asked the question that mattered most to her. "Do I get to decide who visits?" Dr. Patel looked at her before answering. "You and your mother decide together. Medical permission means a visit can happen safely. It does not mean you owe anyone access to you." On the drive home, Willa rested her head against the window and watched the fields pass. "I wish someone had said that before all of this started," she said. "I wish I had understood it sooner." The consequences for my parents arrived without the dramatic collapse they had once planned for me. There were no television cameras, and no crowd gathered to watch them lose everything in a single afternoon. Instead, the losses came through ordinary conversations, signed agreements, and doors that no longer opened for them. After the anniversary gathering, several guests compared the messages my mother had sent them. Church members discovered they had been told that Dr. Patel approved the event. Relatives learned that my mother had claimed I wanted a filmed reconciliation. Older family friends realized she had told them Willa was privately begging to see her grandparents. Each version had been shaped for the person receiving it. The church board removed Marjorie from her role coordinating social events. Their decision was not based on our private family conflict. She had used the church contact list to recruit guests, misrepresented a child's medical condition, and distributed papers intended for a court dispute without explaining what they were. My mother told Lena the church had abandoned her because everyone was afraid of legal trouble. The board's letter said something simpler. Trust was necessary for anyone given access to members' private information, and Marjorie had broken that trust. Walter accepted an agreement in the criminal trespass case. He paid for the damaged doorframe, completed a period of probation, and agreed not to enter or approach the farmhouse without written permission. He did not apologize. Through his attorney, he described the damage as the result of an emotional misunderstanding between a father and daughter. The court record described it as an attempt to enter property after the owner had clearly refused access. My parents also paid the portion of my legal expenses, ordered by the family court. It did not restore the emergency savings Daniel and I had built, but the payment mattered for another reason. For once, the cost of their choices did not belong entirely to me. Lena notified them that all necessary communication had to pass through her office. I blocked their numbers on Willa's tablet and phone, then changed the email address connected to her medical accounts. Marjorie no longer had a pending visitation request. Walter could not treat the farmhouse as a place he was entitled to enter. Neither of them could turn an unexpected appearance into another opportunity to demand an immediate answer. The quiet afterward felt unfamiliar. For years, silence from my mother had meant punishment. It was the pause she created, so I would become anxious enough to call, apologize, and repair whatever boundary had offended her. This silence belonged to me. I did not fill it. Aunt Eleanor contacted Lena 6 weeks after the hearing and asked whether Willa might consider a short visit. She included the dates she would be available and promised to follow any medical requirements we set. She did not ask me to keep the request secret from Willa or imply that refusing would prove I was bitter. I showed Willa the message. "You do not have to see her," I said. Willa read it twice. "Do you think she is only doing this because she feels guilty?" She probably does feel guilty. That does not tell us whether her apology will be honest. What do you want me to do? I want you to choose without worrying about what I want. She asked for a day to think, then agreed to 20 minutes on the back porch. Eleanor stayed at a hotel rather than asking to sleep at the farmhouse. She confirmed that she felt well, completed the test recommended by the transplant team, and wore a mask from the moment she stepped out of her car. She brought no gifts and did not attempt to hug Willa. The three of us sat beneath the porch roof while a light rain moved across the fields. Eleanor kept both hands around a cup of coffee she barely touched. "I believed your grandmother because her story was easier than calling your mother and asking a difficult question," she told Willa. "Then I repeated that story to other people. I am sorry." She did not say she had only meant well. She did not explain that Marjorie could be persuasive or ask us to remember how long they had been sisters. Willa studied her. "Did you really think Mom was keeping me trapped?" "I allowed myself to believe it without asking you." "That is not the same question." Eleanor nodded. "No, I did not know what to think, and I acted as though uncertainty gave me permission to believe the worst." Willa did not forgive her during that visit. She spoke about school, the books she had been reading, and the bird feeder outside her window. When 20 minutes passed, Eleanor stood without asking for more time. Before leaving, she looked at me and said, "Thank you for allowing me to ask properly." It was not a complete repair. It was the beginning of one conducted without force. My mother's sealed envelope remained in my desk drawer for several weeks. Some evenings, I imagined what might be inside. Perhaps she had written an apology. Perhaps she had arranged every sentence to make her actions sound like the unavoidable result of loving Willa too deeply. She might have blamed Walter, the church, her attorney, or me. She might have offered forgiveness for the pain she believed I had caused her. Eventually, I understood that opening the envelope would place me back inside the same old conversation. Marjorie would speak, and I would spend days deciding which parts deserved an answer. I mailed it to Lena unopened. Lena returned it to my mother with a brief notice that I was not accepting personal correspondence. I never learned what the letter said. Not knowing became its own form of freedom. As Willa grew stronger, she asked whether we could change the upstairs bedroom. It was the room my mother had wanted me to lock her inside, while 40 guests celebrated below. Willa said she no longer wanted it to feel like a place designed only for sleeping and being watched. We painted the walls a soft yellow. I washed the curtains, and she insisted on opening them as wide as the frames allowed. We moved a small desk beneath the window, added shelves for her sketchbooks, and placed a deep chair in the corner where she could read when she lacked the energy to go downstairs. Willa made a wooden sign for the door. "Healing happens here. Entry by invitation." She asked whether the wording sounded too severe. "It sounds clear," I said. 1 year after the day I brought her home from the transplant center, Willa handed me a sheet of notebook paper. 6 names were written on it. Ruth and her husband were included, along with Eleanor, 2 friends from school, and a nurse from the transplant center who had stayed in touch. "I want to have lunch on the porch," she said. Nothing big. Everyone already agreed to follow the rules. I looked through the window at the gate, where 40 people had once waited for me to surrender. Then I looked at the list my daughter had written herself. No one had chosen the guests for her. No one had promised them access before asking permission. No camera would be waiting for the wrong reaction. Willa smiled carefully. "Would that be all right?" "All right," I said. For the first time, Those words did not mean I had stopped arguing so I could prepare for a fight. They were a free answer given inside a home that belonged to us again. Family was never measured by how many people could gather outside a door. It was measured by who respected that door when it closed, and who waited to enter until they were invited.